from the News Channel 5 Network. This is Que Pasa Nashville.
Bienvenidos and welcome to Que Pasa Nashville. My name is Cristina Allen and thank you for joining us. As you know, we talk about the opportunities and challenges Latinos bring to Middle Tennessee. And recently I was at a panel on immigration, migration, about the Latino growth, as well as how many are leaving the U.S. And I heard John Hiskey, who is the Associated Chair, Professor, and Director of Graduate Studies at Vanderbilt University and the Department of Political Science. You were fabulous. I love the panel discussion, and not for me to come up to you afterwards and say, you need to share this information. So in this, give us like an overview of what's really going on with immigration in the United States.
Sure. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here, Christina, and thank you for inviting me. So an overview of migration in the U.S. In recent years, one thing that I think many people do not realize is that currently more Mexicans are leaving the U.S. than entering into the U.S. And if we go by Custom Border Patrol apprehension data, what we find is that in 2016, we are at an all-time low of Mexicans getting apprehended at the border.
So Mexicans crossing by Border Patrol, it's at a low-time low?
Yes, yes. So in 2000, we reached an all-time high of apprehensions of Mexicans trying to cross into the U.S. That was at 1.6 million Mexicans were apprehended in 2000.
And that's the height of where we really saw them coming undocumented.
Yes, that was the explosion of migration from Mexico. Okay. In 2010, that number had dropped to 400,000. So a drop from 1.6 million to 400,000 in 2010.
Okay.
In 2016, that number is at 190,000.
Okay.
And that's the lowest point since 1973.
And these are people that are no longer crossing in, not returning. Is that correct?
Right. These are
apprehended.
Right, apprehended at the border, and that's the most reliable metric we have in terms of the number of people entering.
What are the trends and why is that happening?
Right. So there's a few factors involved. The first is the demographics of the Mexican population. In 1960, the fertility rate for Mexican women was at 7.0.
Okay, that's probably my mom.
So a lot of, yes, a lot of kids were being born in the 60s, and so that was the Mexican baby boom, if you will. Currently, that fertility rate stands at 2.1. Okay, so what we've seen happen over the past 20 or so years is simply an aging of the Mexican population to the point where once you reach the age of 35 or so, your tendency to migrate drops, drops dramatically. So the first factor behind this trend of decreased migration from Mexico is simply demographics. The second is, despite recent troubles with the Mexican economy, the economy in general has been pretty strong in recent years, particularly in the migrant sending states. So
the migrant sending states of Mexico.
Of Mexico, right. So there are about 7 or 8 states in Mexico that send a majority of migrants to the U.S. It's not a nationwide phenomenon.
Is it like Jalisco?
Jalisco, Guanajuato, Michoacan.
And we find a lot of the state of Jalisco, which is Mexico City, Guadalajara, Puerto Vallarta, a lot of them are coming to Nashville.
Yes.
There's different states go to different
United
States because they know people. I'm amazed of how many from Jalisco are here in Middle Tennessee.
That's where I did my dissertation research many years ago, and we lived in Guadalajara.
Okay.
But the leading sending state is the state of Guanajuato. That state's economy has been booming in recent years, due in large part to foreign investment from the U.S. and other countries.
So you're saying that because of the aging demographic, one, as well as the economy, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mexico's ranked 14th in the world in their economy. I think their gross national product rose 3.4%, 4%.
That's exactly right.
So there are jobs in Mexico.
Yes.
There are opportunities in Mexico. Why are there still some people, which is reduced, about 190,000 apprehended at the border, and there's sure probably a lot more that weren't apprehended.
Right, that's an indicator of kind of the rate of people entering.
Why are they still coming if there's opportunity in Mexico?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. A big one is family connections.
Okay.
So what we find in our research is that if a person living in Mexico has a relative that sends them remittances, that's a strong predictor of that person thinking about migration as well.
But I do know that the third largest revenue income for Mexico, I know oil's one, but number 3 is wire transfers from the United States back to Mexico.
Right.
So obviously they're thinking, okay, they have it good. These are things I've read and I can't source it, but Latinos, when the Mexicans come, it's not just about the remittance, it's the opportunity is they come from really rural areas and least educated. So because they don't know the laws and the rules, they just know that there's a job there waiting for them. They don't understand all the political or the hardship as well. Is that still the case?
Partly. So one, I think, common misunderstanding about migrants from Mexico and other places as well is that they are not the poorest of the poor, and they are not the least educated. They generally have close to a high school education, and they have to have enough income stream for their family to support a trip north. So it is not as if the poorest of the poor are coming to the U.S. Rather, it's a very select group. Generally, again, that are pulled by family and family ties, and it's referred to as the family and friends effect. The other factor that's going on in Mexico that pushes many Mexicans now is the violence that's taking place in specific areas of Mexico related to the drug war taking place in that country. Over 120,000 people have been killed in the past 10 years as a result of the drug war. So people in states like Michoacan in particular are fleeing towns that are essentially controlled by cartels.
And they're not going to other cities in Mexico, they see themselves coming to the U.S. because of a friend and family effect.
Exactly. So that's another factor that's playing into those that are deciding to take the trip north.
So, and then I must have been misspoken, is because I would think a lot of the rural and least educated would come. I have about 25 first cousins in Mexico. I have 3 of them that are U.S. citizens, but they all have jobs, and not all of them are, higher education, but they're a vibrant family. So I don't see that a lot, but we see it in Nashville. Nashville at one time was the 3rd largest population percentage growth. We do see a lot of our Mexicans, a majority of our undocumented. But another thing I remember you saying at the panel was the number of Central Americans coming in. That is where our increase is. So
getting back to trends in migration into the U.S., what's fairly surprising about the numbers that we've seen is that for the first time in recent history at least, more Central Americans are being apprehended at the border than Mexicans, and that happened in 2014 and again in 2016. And the factors behind the flows of migrants from Central America are quite different than what the traditional factors that drive migration have been, namely the horrific violence that's taking place in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And what we see in our research is simply that the Central Americans that are arriving at the border in recent years do not fit the economic migrant profile. They are not leaving for economic reasons. They're not being pulled by the attraction of the U.S. economy. Rather, the major push factor that they're dealing with is the violence they confront on a daily basis.
So if we are looking at the southern border of Mexico, the Central Americans coming in is higher coming into the borders and being apprehended than Mexican. So why wouldn't they stay in Mexico and get a job versus coming all the way to the U.S. southern border?
Well, again, part of that is due to the fact that many of Salvadorans in particular, but also Hondurans, have relatives and friends in the U.S. But I think a larger factor is the Mexican government's role in controlling migration into their country. And so
that's something I think we have to remember. So the Mexicans' role of of their southern border,
right,
for their Central Americans to come into their country.
Yes.
Because I'm sure a lot of them stay there too.
Yes.
And take away jobs from Mexicans.
Well, yes.
Sounds familiar, but
so
you know.
Traditionally, the Mexican government's attitude has been, if you're going to come into our country from the southern border, just keep on moving to the U.S. border.
We don't
okay. So during the Obama administration, he enlisted the support of the Mexican government to implement what was referred to as the Southern Border Plan of the Mexican government.
Okay.
That ramped up enforcement on the Mexican side, to the point where the Mexican government was deporting more Central Americans than the U.S. was.
Okay, I'm going to repeat that just to make sure. So you're saying, in a way, the U.S. Obama administration supported Mexico's southern border to prevent Central Americans coming in because they were more
They're essentially our first line of defense against the...
Okay, is that an aha moment for a lot of people? Because it was for me.
Yes.
I mean, that was information that the assumption it was all Mexicans.
Right.
And we knew we had an increase in our Central Americans. And we knew, and I think something you said, why are they coming? Because they have a conflict of at least twice an occurrence with violence. Is that
yes. Yeah, well, the homicide rates in El Salvador and Honduras are the highest in the world. They're around 100 homicides per 100,000 people, and to compare that to the U.S., I believe that's around 4 per 100,000.
So with them coming, do they have a different, like, political asylum to come into the U.S.?
Right.
So especially the youth that are coming here unaccompanied by adults?
Yes.
What is those numbers?
Yes, so that gets us to the second kind of point, is that many of the Central Americans that are arriving at the U.S. border are turning themselves in. They're not trying to sneak across the border.
They're just like, take me?
They find the nearest Border Patrol agent and say, I want to turn myself in and initiate an asylum claim case. And so many of the women and children that you hear about arriving at the border, they were not caught sneaking across the desert. They turned themselves in. And so, you know, the notion of a wall, for example, would not stop any of that.
Because they're still
Because they're still going to turn themselves in, and what they're trying to do is seek asylum from the violence that they suffer every day of their lives in El Salvador.
We're going to take a quick break, and we're speaking with John Hiskey, who's the Associate Chair, Professor, and Director of Graduate Studies at Vanderbilt in Political Science, but the fascination about immigration, migration, and really what it all means. Join us right back. Gracias.